Hi, this is Matt Alanis, business instructor at the Willow International Center, recording a brief lecture for BA5 Business Communications, a class that I teach here. This is on developing a good style. One thing I will say, a disclaimer before I continue any further: if you have not listened to the first lecture, which is available on the YouTube channel, I do encourage you to go ahead and take a listen to that. It's very brief, I think about 15 to 20 minutes at the very most. What you'll find is that a lot of the content that we go over is going to build upon what we discussed in the previous week. So it is important that you have some foundational type knowledge so that we can build upon in subsequent lectures, and you can use this material and put it into practice. So I do encourage you, if you haven't listened to the first one, stop right now, go back to the first, and then progress sequentially through the series of lectures that we have here for you. This particular chapter is going to take a close look at really the first element of writing in plain English, and that is writing clear, readable sentences. Most students will probably be surprised to find out just how different writing in plain English is from your typical academic style writing. From our last lecture, from what you'll remember is that plain English is different and that it doesn't sound so stuffy. It's more informal but has a positive tone to it. And so we're going to give you some tools that you can use to really put this idea of writing in plain English actually into practice. And these are things that you should be able to use right away. This isn't something that you're going to use a couple years from now, maybe never. These are things that you can instantly implement and put into your writing that will help you become a better and more effective writer. Alright, just to provide kind of a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. One, we're going to go over common words. We'll review contractions, pronouns, active versus a passive type voice, short sentences, proper tone, and lastly we'll go over grammar checkers, and I'll pull up a Word document and show you how to actually use a grammar checker. Very basic stuff, but there's a couple things that you may have to do if you're using Microsoft Word to basically tell your grammar checker to look for certain things. Out of the box, a lot of times it gives you the basic things, but you can actually ask it to have a little bit more functionality, as I'll show you later on in the lecture. Now, one thing I will notice, just another disclaimer, or will say, is that my assumption is that you do have at least a proficient understanding of or proficient use of English. So when I go over some of these things, most notably past participles, pronouns, and things like that, my assumption is that you already have some type of understanding of those things. If for any reason that you don't be too concerned. You can always look those up online, research those on your own so you can get a little bit more familiar. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over the definitional meanings of these types of things because this isn't an English course. This is a course in business writing and speaking, so I'm going to assume that you do have some of that proficiency already. Alright, so let's go over common words here. A couple things on common words. Obviously, a big thing is that contrary to popular belief, you don't really need to use big words to sound educated. And I know that sounds interesting for me to say, especially for someone in the world of academia, because it seems like that's really all we do is try to figure out these big impressive words to use so that people are just so impressed with how smart we are, which is kind of ridiculous. And really, the way you want to communicate it is in a way that people can actually understand. And I've said that several times over the course of the last lecture. It's important to really begin your writing in such a way that people are going to be able to comprehend it. And so trying to use a thesaurus and develop all of these interesting words and big words to be used just so you can sound more intelligent is really not the way to go. Now, one of the things I will mention is that you can use common words. Don't be afraid of sounding less educated by using them. You want to use these types of words because of the fact that people can understand them. And if you're writing to a particular audience, particularly one that maybe doesn't have the technical background that you may be maybe that you have, you do want to use words that people are going to understand. Because remember, in business communication, we're trying to convey something. We're trying to convince someone of maybe our point of, or kind of frame of reference, or our point that we're trying to make. We're trying to relay information. And so you're not so concerned about making yourself seem more intelligent, but you're more concerned with trying to relay that information and really ensure that people are going to understand that. And so you don't have to keep communicating over and over and over. So don't be afraid to use common words in your writing. A couple examples that I'll give you. If you're taking this class over at Willow, you will have access to the textbook that we have here, and there is quite a comprehensive list of various words that have, you know, the bureaucratic format and then the common form as well. And I have a couple listed here that I just kind of came up with on my own here, just to kind of give you an example of these things. But so in bureaucratic writing, you may use a word such as acquiesce, which is a very, not necessarily lengthy word, but it definitely is not common. You would not see the word acquiesce very frequently, and you probably would not use it in a sentence. So I would argue that you probably shouldn't use it in your writing. A more common word would be agree, which is essentially the meaning of acquiesce, to agree to something, essentially. Next, we have desist. So if you were commonly seen a cease and desist letter, which essentially in more common lingo means stop. Last example here is we have frequently in writing, I see a lot of people use the word stated, like so-and-so stated something, which just sounds kind of stuffy and very, very formal to me. It really is just the same way of saying said. So you can see that maybe some of the bureaucratic writing, especially stated, it might be something that you've used fairly frequently, and it isn't a common word, so to speak. So there are ways that you can actually take those words that sound more bureaucratic, sound more stuffy, and actually make them to sound more common for the main point of actually being able to convey your information, to ensure that people can ultimately read that and comprehend it, and then be able to take that and perform something with it if it's something instructional. All right, contractions. Contractions are always fun because if you use grammar checkers, if you have in the past, you'll notice that if you've programmed it to check for grammar, not just the spelling portion, is that grammar checkers do not like contractions. They like you to actually spell out, instead of don't, spell out do not, which contractions are totally fine. You should be able to use those. If you use them when you're speaking, right? You don't say do not and these types of things. People typically use contractions when they speak. So really, why not use them in writing? Most professionals use them. People that have written Pulitzer Prize winning novels and things and received numbers of awards and best-selling books use contractions. So why wouldn't you use contractions? It only makes sense to. Annual reports from different businesses, if you read through those, like I have hundreds of them, you'll note that they use contractions. So why wouldn't we be able to use those in our business writing, essentially, if ultimately it's kind of the same thing? What I find too is that using contractions helps you use plain English. If you don't use contractions and you actually spell the words out without using the apostrophe, then it causes your writing to be more stuffy, to be more formal and rigid, and it instantly kind of puts you in the mindset of making your writing sound more bureaucratic, which is what you don't want to do, essentially. Using contractions also adds credibility and meaning to your writing. And what I mean by that is that people can relate to it better because it sounds more conversational. Remember that you use contractions when you speak. So you should use those when you write as well, and that people will see that it has a more conversational style to it, and it's much more easy to read. You gain more credibility as a writer compared with the mentality that, well, the more lengthy sentences that I have here and the lengthier words and the more difficult words that are used, the more intelligent that I sound. We don't write for the purpose of just elevating ourselves in terms of stature. We write for the purpose of conveying information, so that's extremely important there. Now, a couple of reputable sources to use regularly with regards to contractions. First off, I mentioned that most professionals will use contractions frequently. So obviously if professionals that are actually doing the work are using contractions, it would make sense that we would be able to do that too. Best-selling authors, I mentioned that before, also use contractions fairly regularly. Business produce annual reports as well will also use contractions. All right, let's talk about pronouns here real quick. Just to kind of rehash, obviously pronouns, people, place, things, those types of things and everything. I'm sorry, not pronouns. Pronouns being I, we, you, those types of things. Reading off the wrong notes here. As far as pronouns, don't be afraid to use them. I've seen a lot of writing that is really afraid of using words such as I, we, you, those types of things. And it makes it really difficult. If you've actually tried to write something without using those words, it just doesn't sound right. It doesn't come off correctly. You have to change the structure of the sentences around, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So don't be afraid to use pronouns. Pronouns are not bad, and I'm not sure why we got into the habit of really failing to use them, so to speak. What I mentioned before is that if you don't use pronouns, there is a significant effect on your writing, a significant negative effect on your writing, I might add, because you do have to change a lot of the sentences around for it to actually make sense, because you can't use I or we or you. You have to write it in such a way that you can avoid using those words, but you make the same point. And typically what you have to do is your sentences have to be more lengthy to get to that same point. So why not do less work, right? This sounds kind of funny. I'm telling you to do less work, but it's true, and ultimately convey the same message in a more effective manner. One thing I mentioned too is it's important to write like you're sending an email. What I've noticed when I receive emails from students, and they're typically written in a very informal type tone, more conversational, maybe too conversational and too informal to a degree, but at the same time, students seem more comfortable in writing emails. And not just students, everybody in general typically writes in a different style in an email versus something that's physically on paper. And so try writing like you write in an email. Keep things conversational. Use the same words that you would use in a face-to-face type conversation. Instantly when people sit down and actually have to draft a letter or a memo, they start to use longer words and longer sentences and change the sentence structure and avoiding pronouns and avoiding contractions, which doesn't really make sense. So when you're writing things, stick to the mentality of an email in the terms of making it more informal, making it easier to use. One of the things I will also mention with regards to pronouns is that pronouns are really some of the most common words in language. And if you take out some of the most common words that are used in the English language, you really don't have a whole lot left to choose from, which thus makes a very drastic effect on your writing. Avoiding pronouns also will basically reduce, or you will suffer a loss of what's called fluency. And what I mean by that is that there's no sense of flow to the actual argument because it becomes very choppy, so to speak. And also avoiding pronouns, you're subject to use what's called passive writing, which we'll go over here in a few slides, if not the next slide, and we'll discuss what that looks like. All right, active versus passive writing here. Now, using an active voice is very important and is the key, absolute most important thing to writing clearly. Passive sentences don't necessarily leave out key, or they do have to leave out key information, most notably the actor, the person that's doing something, as you'll find out. So what happens is that readers have less information to go off of in passive sentences than in active ones, and they have to struggle to find out what the sentence is actually trying to say or who it's referring to. So let's go over a couple things here with regards to active versus passive voice. Now there are several common voice identifiers. Well, really, before I actually get into this, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let me provide you with a brief example of what is an active versus a passive voice here. So first off, kind of definitional terms. An active voice, what you would do is that the subject in the sentence is actually doing something. Okay? And when I give you the example of the sentence, this will make a little bit more sense. In a passive sentence, the subject in the sentence isn't doing anything at all. Okay, so keep those two things in mind when I read you these first sentences. The first sentence, the car is washed by Fred. Okay, this would be an example of a passive sentence because Fred isn't necessarily doing anything, or the car, I'm sorry, isn't necessarily doing anything. The car is the subject in this sentence because it precedes Fred. So the car is washed by Fred. The car is just sitting there. It's not performing anything. It's not doing anything. It's thus a passive sentence. An active sentence, if I were to rephrase this, would be Fred washes the car. You'll notice that Fred is actually doing something. In this sentence, he is actually washing the car, and thus it's an active sentence. Okay, so those would be the two differences. Now, a couple other things that you can do to identify passive voice in sentences are a couple things. First, you will look for the form of the verb to be, and these could be am, are, is, was, were, be, been, being. Those are common forms of the verb to be. If you see those verbs in a sentence, the chances are, although it's not 100%, but the chances are is that the sentence is written with a passive voice. So that could be a key indicator there. Okay? You'll notice in that sentence that the car is washed by Fred. Okay? Next, a past participle is usually present. Okay? A past participles usually end with en it's en or ed. I have a typo listed on the slide. So ed or en would be a past participle. So if you see those things, those normally could be an indicator that there is a past participle and thus written in a passive voice. In our case, we had the car is washed by Fred, washed being ed. So that would be a good indication. In addition to a past participle and using the verb to be, you can also look for a prepositional or prepositional phrase beginning with by. By is very, very important. And what I mean by is it's a preposition, for that matter, is an indication of location. And most importantly, not just physical location, but it could also be a location in time. So if you refer back to the sentence that I gave you, the car is washed by Fred, by is also a key indicator that this is written in a passive voice. So in our case here, we have a couple of things, most notably a past participle and a prepositional phrase that would indicate that this is actually written in a passive voice. So those are key indicators that you'll look for to make that determination. Now, one thing I will know is that it's not always bad to use a passive voice. There are certain situations in which a passive voice is actually good to use and is actually appropriate to use. And there's three common things. The first one is if you don't know who is actually performing the action. If you don't know the actor, so to speak, if you don't know Fred obviously is washing the car, then you can use a passive voice because it isn't very important to relay to the reader. The next thing you can look at is if somebody knows who performed the action. If it's considered to be common knowledge that Fred washed the car, then maybe we don't need to put him in the sentence because everyone already knows. It doesn't add any value to the sentence. So that would be another example of a sentence where you can actually use a passive voice and it would be okay. The last one that you can look at is if you don't want to emphasize the actor, or if doing so, no one would really be confused if Fred isn't there, essentially. So those would be the three reasons that you would use a passive voice over an active voice. Other than that, I would really use an active voice because, like I said, it helps you write in plain English, and it really is the key to writing clearly. Next, let's talk about using short sentences. Now, one of the things I will say is that I don't necessarily recommend you use a lot of short sentences because the problem with that, as you probably already know, is that it causes your writing to look very choppy. If you have just a lot of short sentences, that you really need some lengthier sentences to really add some type of value and kind of mix things up, so to speak. Now, one thing I will say is that you don't necessarily, when you write, you don't need to be kind of measuring your sentences in terms of words per sentence and saying, okay, well, I wrote one with 9 words per sentence, so now I need to write one with 6, and now I need to write one with 9 and then 6. That's not what I'm saying. I don't need you to be constantly monitoring your writing in that way, but I do think that you do need to use some short sentences sporadically throughout an actual paper. Typically, I would say interwoven, maybe about 3 to 4 per page. And it's just a way to break things up a little bit, to make it, sound a little more fluid. If you're reading lots of lengthy sentences, it really gets difficult to read. I mean, if you've tried reading any type of academic article or journal or anything for that matter, a lot of times they're written with very long sentences, and it can be very difficult to read and frankly exhausting because there are so many words in the sentence without any pauses, and it gets very difficult to read. Now, short sentences have fewer than 9 words, so that would be a good gauge of whether you're writing with a short sentence. So fewer than 9 words. Like I said, you don't need to use every sentence, doesn't need to be a short sentence, but you do want to kind of sporadically kind of put these throughout the page. Like I said, 3 to 4 probably per page would probably be a nice addition. Now, one thing with sentences is you don't want to exceed 17 words in your average sentence. Once you go over 17 words, you're really getting into the phase where it can be broken up probably into 2, if not 3 other sentences, depending on what you're trying to communicate. So try not to go over 17 words. It definitely kind of changes the tone of your writing. If you're trying to use plain English and write over 17 words in a sentence, it gets really difficult to do that. Okay, next thing let's talk about is tone. Obviously, plain English allows for a full range of tones. It's very versatile, as you'll call it, because plain English you can write in a very formal tone, or a very informal tone, I should say. You can write more in an appropriate type tone. But with bureaucratic writing, you can only write in a formal tone. You can only write in one way. It doesn't make sense to write in a bureaucratic style and it be informal. So writing in plain English, you can be more versatile. You have more options, so to speak, which is very, very important. I mentioned the bureaucratic style being very formal. Your plain English, you can be overly informal. And obviously you can have an appropriate style tone as well. We've all seen the overly informal tones typically in emails where people get a little bit too loose-lipped, so to speak, and kind of a little too informal. We've all seen those types of emails before. There is a good example of one actually in your book. I don't remember the page it's on, but I know that it is in chapter 2 somewhere that you can look at to provide an example just of how informal something can be, and obviously you don't want to come across like that, so to speak. But like I mentioned before, is that your plain English will allow you to vary your tone, so you can accommodate a particular audience, and that obviously is important that you understand who your audience is so that you can vary your tone in order to better reach them. Alright, lastly, we are going to finish up with grammar checkers, and I'm going to give you a little brief kind of tutorial on how to actually use a grammar checker, how to change some of the options. I'm using the latest version of Microsoft Office here, so hopefully you have something similar, but they usually are pretty similar in terms of the functionality and how to change things and everything. So grammar checkers, one thing I'll mention first is that they are not perfect. One of the things is that they do not recommend that you use contractions, which, as we know after listening to me ramble on and on, that contractions are okay. Use them when you speak, so use them when you write. But grammar checkers will obviously flag those contractions and recommend that you not use them, but they are totally okay. Don't be so concerned with the grammar aspect when using them. A lot of people will email me and say, the grammar checker is flagging every couple word, every sentence, and I really don't know what to do, and I'm trying to change it, but it keeps flagging it. I'm not so concerned with the actual grammar checker. The reason is that it's essentially, if a sentence doesn't make sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense. Okay? You're very intelligent. You've had some background, obviously some education, formal education with regards to English and that sort of thing. If a sentence makes sense to you, it probably does make sense. And even if the grammar checker is telling you that it doesn't, It's a computer program. It was designed by people to pick up on certain things. It's not a perfect system. So don't be so concerned with the actual grammar portion. I'm more concerned with using it for a couple different things, which we'll go over. There are 4 main things that grammar checkers are very, very good at, and this is what I want you to key in on. The first of which is determining your average sentence length, or words per sentence, so to speak. This gives you an indication of how lengthy your sentences are. And obviously, as we know from short sentences, we want to keep them below 17 words per sentence on average. You wouldn't want to go over that because you're getting into the point to where it's getting more bureaucratic, not plain English, so to speak. So grammar checkers will tell you what your average sentence length is. That way you don't have to go ahead and calculate it on your own, because that would take forever. The next thing is you can determine how hard your sentences are to read, which are basically characters per word. Now this isn't a perfect system because the computer can't tell you if the word is common. Like if you use the word Mississippi in a sentence, it's going to maybe throw the numbers off a little bit because Mississippi is a long word, but it's common, right? It's not something that you wouldn't see all the time or anything like that. So the computer can't differentiate between common versus uncommon words, but still it will tell you roughly how long your words are that you're using on average, and it is an average, so obviously some of the common words that are lengthier will balance out with some of the common words that are shorter, assuming that you're using a fair dose of them. Now, just kind of some best practices, so to speak, what to look for when you use these is try to stay below 5 characters. And I don't mean 5 characters for every word. I mean on average 5 characters, okay? So that is important. I don't want you, trying to figure out how to write every single sentence in a report with only 5 words. So make sure that you can actually do that. The next thing is that, like I said before, keep in mind that computers don't necessarily have the ability to identify common words, so do keep that in mind when you're running these types of things. Third, you can actually determine the percentage of your sentences that are using a passive voice. It will actually tell you this up front. And although it's not a perfect system like anything, it does give you some indication for how many sentences use a passive voice, or at least the percentage, so that you can go through and possibly change those. With regards to passive voice, I recommend you stay below 10%, preferably lower, but at 10% on the high end would be adequate, so to speak. Like we mentioned before, passive voice isn't all that bad. You can use it in certain situations, but it's not very common. All right, next, grammar checkers are very good for determining what's known as your readability index. Okay, your readability index essentially tells you how easy it is for your work to read. It's basically it. Very simple. There are 2 statistics that will be given to you, or 2 kind of numbers that will be given to you by a grammar checker. The first is the Fleisch-Kincaid grade level, and the second is the Fleisch Reading Ease Index. Okay, these are both indexes, and they measure 2 different things. Okay, one thing is it's a rough estimate, so it's not exact, but it will give you some idea, at least kind of a ballpark figure of how easy it is for your writing to read. Now the first one, the Fleisch-Kincaid grade level index, is basically you want to stick to 12 or less, and this is grade level, so this is writing at a 12th grade level. And I know through your formal education and coming up through high school and even before that, you were kind of taught that writing at a higher level is good, right? If you can read at a 12th grade level and you were in 9th grade, you were advanced. So that would make sense that if I can write at a 12th grade level and I'm in 9th grade, wouldn't that be great? So we should try to aspire to write at a higher level. Remember, with business communication, we want people to be able to read it. There's no point in writing something that no one can understand, because you're not accomplishing anything, right? Business is about accomplishing things, not about creating more work. So try to stick to an index 12 or less. With the reading ease index, this actually higher is better. Okay, so it's not necessarily like golf, like the grade level index is. Higher is better in this case. So you want to be 40 or higher with regards to the reading ease level index. Okay. So let's go ahead and we'll show you how to run a grammar checker real quick. So let me kind of tab over here to this document that I created. It's basically taken from your textbook. I think it's one of the exercises in the back if you're taking the class Business Communications and have access to the book here. But it's a quick memo. You'll notice by just kind of glancing at it real quick that obviously it's not written in plain English, which is by design because we do want to test the actual grammar checker here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to click this spelling and grammar checker. And I've already programmed it so that it actually will run all these different things here. And you'll notice a couple different things that are given, and I'll kind of move this over here so we can see both. What you want to pay attention to is the averages here. So first off, you have sentences per paragraph, which we don't necessarily care about a whole lot. Unless it gets too long, and then obviously you do need to move on to a new paragraph. But words per sentence, we have 12.6 words per sentence, which isn't necessarily bad, right? Remember that 17, that average was kind of high. 9 or fewer is considered to be not too bad. So 12, we're kind of in the ballpark. That isn't really too bad here. Characters per word, though, or we want to stay on average 5 or less on average, and we have 6.3. So we are using more formal writing, more bureaucratic. We're probably picking less common words to kind of explain our point, so we have some opportunity here to kind of dumb this down a little bit. Maybe that's the wrong word to say, dumb this down. It kind of has a negative connotation, but make it easier to read, essentially, is the point that I'm trying to convey. And obviously we have readability. So the first thing we'll look at here, passive sentences, 66%. This entire document, for the most part, or at least 2/3 of it, is written in a passive format, which is very, very, kind of difficult to read. Obviously it's not the best way to write an actual document, at least for business communication purposes. So we have some opportunity here for some revision as well. For the Flesch Reading Ease Index, we have 17.7. Remember that we wanted to be above 40, and we are nowhere near that. So this document you wouldn't consider to be very easy to read, and this is probably, it has something to do with the fact that we're using a significant amount of passive sentences. And lastly, the Flesch-Kincaid grade level index is at 13.4. So we're writing at a 13 to 14th grade level index, so to speak, which isn't too bad. It's not too much higher than that 12th grade level that we were trying to aspire to before, but it is obviously outside of that particular realm. So we do have some opportunities there to actually rework this. So that's a good example of what you can do and what the grammar checker is actually used for. Remember, we're not so concerned with the actual grammar piece and all those different types of things, but these indexes, although they're not perfect, will give you a little bit of a pulse on how your writing is. If you're being overly formal and may have problems with people actually understanding, or if you're writing in plain English, which obviously is something that we actually want to aspire to write in. All right, well, that concludes this brief lecture just on developing good style. I hope some of the information that we went over here is going to help you, and you can put this into practice right away and increase the effectiveness of your writing for whatever writing it is that you do. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, obviously my information is on this slide. Feel free and let me know, and I'd be happy to assist you. Otherwise, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.